On today's video, I'm going to be giving you a top 10 list of the most racist places in Florida. As usual, we're going to come at you with brutal honesty and say things for what they are, not for what sounds pretty. The first thing that we need to do is establish what place isn't racist. And I would understand that if the Cuban community really was suppressing the African American community in Miami, I wouldn't be getting so much love when I go to their community. From what I've always understood, there's a lot of racist Cubans, but for the most part, the African American community and the Cuban community have a pretty good standing. It's not really logical to look at a community of immigrants and expect them to give you opportunities. And it's always important to note that racism can come from any community. Any community can practice racism and economically exclude other people. Florida is denoted for having economical racism, much different than the southern segregationist racism that you'll find in other parts of the United States. In Naples, Florida, where the Rosemary Cemetery is, when they put in the major roads like Pine Ridge Road in Naples, they did that right over the place where the black people were buried. Chances are you've literally driven over black people's graves. So it's important to know that a lot of the history regarding African Americans and the horrible things that were done to them here in Florida isn't something you're going to find in a textbook. There's been an effort to cover up and hide the history of Florida underneath the Robles Park housing projects. They literally built the housing complex for African Americans over Zion Cemetery, which was an African American cemetery, which goes to show the levels of disrespect that authority in Florida has gone to ensure that they can disrespect even the grave sites of African Americans. The area's history is horrendous. Racism is a selfish desire to exclude other people from your community and make sure that only you can live there. And in that sense, there are a few African American communities in Florida that have been doing just that. Forgetting about race, exclusion, just the ideology of trying to keep people out of your community in a sense of regionalism also constitutes a type of racism within itself. Notice the use of words like our state, like this person thinks that they own it. Anybody can move to any state they want to. That's one of the principal founding factors of the Constitution. A lot of times can be in any direction. In this case, this is a Hispanic person who hates New Yorkers. Notice words like our kids, our state, my kids, American born. These are all regionalistic racist tendencies, using terminologies like the word native to denote that they have more rights than other people, when in reality, everybody has the same rights. So we can see here how racism can come from any direction and it can be aimed at anyone, and how regionalism itself plays a huge role in racism. Resent that people from other places are moving here and they feel like they have more rights to be here than others. Number one is Jacksonville, Florida. I realize that there's a correlation between high overdose death rates and racism. In 2021, almost 600 people died in Jacksonville from overdoses. Miami-Dade has more than twice the population of Duval, and they had less than 440 deaths from overdoses. Drugs are used as a weapon in racism. The overdose death rate for African Americans in Duval is 40, but for whites, it's 66. The same is true in Lafayette County, where blacks are 95 per 100,000, while whites are only 29 per 100,000. Not only is there a correlation between drug use and racism, but there's also a correlation between minorities dying at higher proportions in North Florida counties, which would suggest that drugs are in fact being used as a weapon. Without a doubt, Jacksonville, the largest city in North Florida, is a battleground for racism, regionalism, and economical battles of who gets to control the labor force. With many people moving to Jacksonville having to start their own businesses as the local labor force doesn't let them incorporate. Number two is Hatchi, Florida, a small town in the Big Bend region that only has 5 black people. Now, having a small black population or being predominantly white doesn't exactly mean that a town is racist and backwards. It's the fact that it's known as a sundown town. Social media accounts of people in the Big Bend region and Facebook groups show that the people are very comfortable, that the people are somewhat openly racist and don't really have any fear of voicing their views. After all, most people in their community are white, so who's going to complain? Remember earlier in the video we were talking about regionalism? Well, there's even a place called Yankeetown in this part of Florida, referring to the fact that a few people from up north moved there, which just goes to show that regionalism here is very strong, and that puts it on this list at number 2. Coastal communities along the Big Bend region of Florida are almost exclusively white. And this isn't exactly a problem in any way, it's almost a symptom of racism. Other adjacent communities like Cedar Key also have a reputation of being a sundown town, so this region of Florida definitely isn't the most welcoming to outsiders. Number 3 is Homosassa. The history of this town: they had over 1,000 slaves here. Yuli, who actually lived in the Jacksonville area in the 1850s, ran a mill here where they made sugar, syrup, molasses, and of course rum in a time period where the Civil War was going on and the Confederates desperately needed these products. After the war, Yuli was imprisoned, the slaves were freed, and none of them practically stayed in this area. They were like, yeah, we gotta go now. Which is kind of odd because for the most part, slaves would stay in the geographical area where they originally lived. But Jose, that was in the 1800s. That was a long time ago. Except for the fact that the black population hasn't returned to this area, and one of the biggest attractions to the city is a monkey island, which is said to be kind of a pun joke. Part of the plantation in the mill is still here on a little country road by the side of the road. You can see the large hand-hammered kettles that were used for the molasses and the syrup pre-industrial revolution. Number 4 is Titusville, Florida. One of my first viral videos on this channel was in Titusville, as the locals became enraged at my YouTube video, and some of the comments that I've read from my Titusville videos have been the most shocking. These people really are hateful, bitter of outsiders. This whole region of Eastern Florida up here has a lot of racial profiling problems, despite the fact that the black community is far less propense to be dying from an overdose and using drugs. It's the black areas that the police wants to spend the most time in. And if you ask the locals of Titusville or Brevard County, where most of the drug problems are in their community, they're quick to say, oh, it's the black area. However, when you look at the analytics of who's dying from drug overdoses, the white population is by far significantly more likely to die from drugs. However, popular opinion in this county and police patrolling happens predominantly on the black community because the people with the least drug overdose death rates are clearly the problem. And on top of that, then you have incarceration rates as well, which means that despite clearly the problem here is the white population, they want to label their black community as the problem. Regardless, the overdose death rates in Brevard County are some of the highest in the entire state of Florida. This community is flooded with drugs. In the 1960s and 70s, this area did have a massive population boom. Decades since then, the locals continue to blame what happened back in the 70s as the reason why their town today sucks. But whether blaming the past or blaming their African American community, the only people they're not blaming is themselves. Miami-Dade County only had about 100 more overdose deaths than Brevard. What an embarrassment. We're talking a death rate about 6 times higher. Could it be that drugs make people angry and that in turn makes them violently racist? I'm not sure. Whatever the reason, there's definitely a clear correlation between racism and drug use. Number 5 is Melbourne, Florida. In the same region as Titusville and having exactly the same problems as Titusville, The same problem. The police wants to spend all their time in the black community, even though the drug rampage is all over the city. The police here spends a good deal of their time patrolling and even setting up additional checkpoints or stop sign checks in the black community. Basically everything they can to put police in the black area while drugs run rampant throughout the entire city. Law enforcement's only concerned with the small black community. It's shockingly clear, even to somebody visiting Melbourne for the first time, that there's homelessness, addiction, and crime all over the city, yet the only area being heavily patrolled is the small black community. The police will go ahead and set up speed traps and stop sign checks in neighborhoods that are predominantly black and find any excuse they can to pull over black people because of the blatant racial profiling. Melbourne, Florida makes it on our list. Number 6 is Fort McCoy in the region of the Ocala National Forest. This region as well happens to have incredibly high drug use. The people here are hateful of outsiders, and people who report moving to this community of any other race other than white have had a very difficult time. Racism here is open, it's blatant, and people many times use weapons as intimidation to ensure that black people and other minorities don't feel welcome in this very remote and rural part of Florida. Marion County as a whole is denoted for being racist and hostile to outsiders, and a lot of people have moved to this rural part of Florida only to find out that the locals are very hostile. The hostility towards outsiders here has made this one of the most affordable real estate markets in Florida, where people are simply afraid to buy properties because they know the nightmares that await them if they move here. Fences, cameras, rebel flags, and the sound of gunfire is a normal thing here. The region around the Ocala National Forest is definitely one of the most unsettling places you're going to venture to in Florida, where people have extreme views, and anyone who doesn't match the profile will have a very scary time. Number 7 is Brooksville, one of the most hostile towns you're going to find in the entire state of Florida, where the black communities are living in stark contrast economically to the white population. Racism here is very similar to what you're going to find in Alabama, where it's more of an institutionalized Jim Crow era type of racism, as well as the fact that the good old boy system is said to be strong here still. The views of the people here are conflicting, as some residents are openly racist and want to promote their views. Despite that, the area continues to grow, with many Hispanics of Puerto Rican origin, as well as Cubans, moving to the area and starting businesses. With support of a lot of people moving from out of state, they're trying to start a community here, but the locals are resentful, hateful, and there is a huge conflict here, race-based, similar to what you're going to find in the Deep South. The history of racism in this Florida town is among one of the worst in the entire state of Florida. If you look at income analytics, incarceration rates, and other statistics for African Americans in this region of Florida, it is really disappointing. The town's events and history and culture are so steeped in racism and Confederacism, it would be hard to argue that this town doesn't belong on today's list. Number 8, North Fort Myers. That includes Pomona Park and Suncoast Estates. This region of Fort Myers has a high concentration of rebel flags, poverty, drug addiction, and some of the lowest incomes in the entire state of Florida. The area is predominantly white, and the locals are very vocal about how they feel about outsiders. Despite being one of the most bedbug bitten and impoverished regions of Fort Myers, if you ask the locals here, they think they're the superior race. Many of the people that live here swear that it's one of the best places you could ever put your family. However, according to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement website, they also have one of the largest concentration of registered offenders in the entire state. Despite bed bugs, poverty, and broken crack pipes, these people here still think they're better than others. Number 9 is Fort Myers Beach. Despite being in Lee County, Florida, Where there's a considerable black and Hispanic population, it's almost 98% white. And that doesn't by itself inherently make it a racist place. What makes it a racist place is how those people feel about people that aren't like them. What's up, everybody? This is Jose from Sun Life, and in today's video, I want to show you guys the saddest looking beach you'll ever see in Florida. It was the only beach in Lee County that persons of color could enjoy. Oh, I see where this is going. I guess if black people were to go to the beach back in the day, they would be arrested. There's fragments of concrete. There's nothing really much to be proud here back then or now. I want to kind of find my way to the other side of the beach, but I don't know what would happen if I walk through this stuff. Not a lot of sand, a lot of algae, and a horrible history. I hadn't even thought about the irony of that situation until now that we're here making this video. At times, they've even tried to ban people who don't live on the island from going to beaches. They literally just want this whole place all to themselves. People who go to fish on the island from Fort Myers report that they are constantly harassed by Florida Fish and Wildlife and other law enforcement agencies, and the policies that are put in place on this island are very clear. They're rich, it's their island, and they don't want anybody here that isn't them. After Hurricane Ian, many of the workers reported that they were going to stop working for these people because they didn't like how they were being treated. And many people in Southwest Florida told me that they felt absolutely no sympathy for the people of Fort Myers Beach and what they were going through based on how they treat other people. I've worked on the island as well, and while I have met some great people on the island, I can confirm to you that the vast majority of these people just look at the rest of us as servants to them. Many of the people that came to work for the hurricane cleanup simply left because they had no pleasure working for the people here who feel like they deserve everything and that everybody else is just simply a servant to them. Many people on the island even think that they're above the law. They ignored the evacuation orders and they stayed on the island. Many of them even lost their lives. The racism and looking down upon other people here is so strong that it goes above racial lines and even includes, well, you have to not just be white, you have to be white and part of their social economic circle. Number 10 is Pensacola. Analytically, this place is abysmal. Despite the fact there is a considerable Asian population for being Florida, the Hispanic community here is minimal. And I have talked to people of Asian descent who have moved to this region of Florida, and they've had to move out because the racism that they faced was putting their family's safety in peril. While they wanted me to keep them anonymous, they explained that a particular teacher was pretty much bullying their child and encouraging other children to do the same within the school systems. Despite their complaints, pretty much nothing was done about it. Being surrounded by Alabama, it's no surprise that Pensacola is a very hostile place, and people of all races here are going to have to deal with not only racism, but pretty much the loss of segregation that are common throughout the Deep South. Analytics here are bad. High crime rates, high murder rates, everything that's bad is prevalent here. And this little corner of Florida is not only geographically but also analytically tied in more to Alabama than it is to the rest of the state. There's a lot of problems in this region of Florida, and racism is just another factor that makes this place a miserable place to live. The people here are not just racist and extremists, they're also very vocal. Love is not prevalent here. Hate is what consumes the average person. According to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, not only does it already have one of the highest rates of drug overdose deaths, but it just continues to shoot straight up with no end in sight. With its proximity to the Deep South, it's got more in common with Alabama than it does with the rest of Florida. Alright guys, that's today's video, and I do want to mention that not all towns in Florida that are small and rural are going to be backwards and racist. Shout out to all the small towns in Florida that show us love, and again, not every small town in Florida is like that. There's a lot of great little small towns